Hey guys, Varric here. So this video is going to be on Durumu, the 7th boss in the Throne of Thunder. Now this boss is a slight ramp up in difficulty, especially compared to G-Kun and Megara. And that's really due to one ability or one mechanic later in the fight. Um, and it really just boils down to player skill. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. What I mean by that is if you have people in the raid that aren't adept at doing their job, whether it's healing or DPSing while they're having to move, it's going to be a little rough. It just takes some practice. Once you get used to it, it's really not that bad. Once you get used to this particular mechanic, the fight's actually really simple. But we'll go ahead and get started. Now, when the fight starts, you're just dealing with Durumu. We'll call this the first phase. There's really only two abilities that you need to watch out for. The first being Lingering Gaze, where he would just target one or two random people in the raid. And you'll basically get like a countdown. Now, once about 3 seconds have gone by, you'll basically drop like a purple void zone on the ground. Now, it's important that if you do get targeted with this, that you want to try to drop this purple zone as far to the edge as you can get it. As long as you're not standing too close to the edge, feel free to just disengage as close as you can, just to have the ability to drop and then move out of it. You don't want to stand in for obvious reasons. And the reason being is you want to drop this on the edge of the platform because it comes into play later in the fight, and I'll explain why. The other ability that you need to watch out for is called Force of Will. Now this ability basically, he'll do like a conal effect on the ground, like a purple conal effect. And if you're standing in this, after about a couple of seconds, it will basically knock you off the platform. And unlike G-Kun, if you get knocked off this platform, you'll die. So just keep that in mind. If you get the warning that you're standing in this zone, just immediately get out of it. You only have a couple of seconds, so you need to be real quick about moving. But that's pretty much it for that phase. Now the next phase is called the colorblind phase. Now there's something to keep in mind right before this phase starts. You'll notice there'll be like little 3 red plumes of smoke on the ground and then like one blue one. Now it's very important to notice the positions of these, especially the blue one. And I'll explain why in a minute. Now when this phase starts, 3 random people will be targeted by 3 different color beams: the red beam, the blue beam, and the yellow beam. Now the yellow beam is the least dangerous out of the 3. In fact, after the phase starts, the yellow beam will kind of just do its own thing and just rotate on its own. It won't be attached to any particular raid member. However, it is important that you have at least 1 or 2 people in this beam, preferably 2 or more. Because what happens is the more people you have in these beams, the damage gets spread out over the raid, so it's not just concentrated on 1 or 2 people. Normally the yellow beam the tanks will stay in there. You really only have to worry about that beam for the tanks. There's really no reason to put anybody else in there. Now the blue beam is very important. Basically what happens is if you happen to get targeted with the blue beam, you do not want to move. Unless, if you noticed at the beginning of this phase where that blue puff of smoke was, as long as you're not standing on top of that, you're fine. If you happen to notice that spawn and you happen to be right on top of that, then yeah, you need to move. Otherwise, do not move. The reason being is those puffs of smoke are basically the placements of invisible ads that are around the room. In this case, if for some reason you uncover this mob called the Azure Fog, and it becomes uncovered by the blue beam, it will immediately do about 300,000 damage to the raid. So it's very important that if you see this little puff of smoke before it, and you know where it's at, and somebody gets the blue beam, make sure they don't run over this. They just need to stand still and do what they need to be doing. Normally the range will stand in this beam to kind of help spread the damage out. 2 or 3 people are fine, but obviously if you have more range in it, that's fine too. It really doesn't matter. The more people, the less damage the raid's going to take. However, keep in mind that for everybody that's standing in each of these beams, they will basically get a stacking debuff on them that will increase the damage of that particular beam. In the beginning, it's not a real big deal. The damage really isn't out of control, especially if you have enough people standing in these beams. It's just something to keep in mind for later on. Now the red beam is what really will make or break this phase. As I said earlier, those 3 red puffs of smoke are where the 3 invisible adds are for that beam, called the crimson fogs. Unlike the blue fog, you want to uncover the crimson fogs. So whoever is targeted by the red beam will need to move around the roof to uncover these fogs. However, it's imperative that once they're uncovered that you don't run past them and let them despawn. If you should uncover a crimson fog and then immediately run past him and he disappears, it will do about 300,000 damage to the raid. So it's imperative that once the crimson fogs are uncovered, that you just kill the fog and then move on to find the other 2. If you get targeted with a red fog, feel free to attack it. It doesn't have a lot of health. They go down pretty quickly. Otherwise, just stay in the blue fog and DPS the boss. You really shouldn't have any reason to move out of the blue fog. Now, once the last crimson fog is down, this phase will end. And you'll kind of go back to the first phase again. You'll have to deal with the lingering gaze and the force of will. So just watch out for those 2 like you did before. Now, this third phase is the most dangerous and will probably cause the most wipes for your raid, especially in the beginning. And this is the mechanic I was talking about at the start of the video. Basically what happens is the trigger of this phase, he'll start casting a disintegration beam straight out in front of him. Now the beam itself, at least at the start, is harmless. It's just kind of a marker letting you know that this phase is getting ready to start. As he's casting this beam, I believe it's about 10 seconds or so, you'll notice the little purple web-like graphic on the ground. Sometimes it's to the right of him, sometimes it's to the left of him. It's random. It'll never be the same each time. As soon as you see this, you need to get into it. And what happens basically after about 10 seconds, he will immediately start rotating around. Now, at this point, the disintegration beam that he was casting before will become basically, if you come into contact with this beam, it'll kill you. It's a one-shot. So once he's done and he starts moving around, you do not want to touch this beam. At the same time, the whole arena will become kind of covered in this purple fog. And the ground will be impossible to see except for a certain section on the ground, kind of right next to the beam, whichever way he's rotating. Now, underneath that fog, there's going to be a kind of patch of ground called eyesores on the ground. If you run over these eyesores, it basically, I think it's 75 to 100,000 damage a second. And sometimes it's difficult to see, especially with the purple fog. There is a safe zone, like I said, is right next to this beam, so it's kind of a tight area. And basically, the eyesore on the ground will form a maze as he's going around. The phase will end once he does a full 360, but you need to keep moving around with him while not getting too close to the beam and not running over these eyesores. So that's why I said it was imperative that you're still able to do your normal raid job and still be able to move. However, at least for a DPS, if you're not real comfortable with DPSing on the move, then just concentrating on staying alive. That's the priority, at least for the first couple of times until you get comfortable with this phase. Now, if you remember the beginning of the fight, I said you wanted to put those purple pools of the lingering gaze on the outside edge. The reason being, as you're walking around this room, if you happen to run over those purple pools, and they're either in the middle or close to the boss, if you run over those and then happen to run over one of the eyesores on the ground, you're probably going to die. It just makes things more complicated than it needs to be. So that's why I said it was imperative that you put these the lingering gaze pools on the outside edge so they don't become an issue during this phase, because your first few attempts, this phase is going to probably rattle some of your raid members if they're not used to this kind of mechanic. Now, it's also not perfect. The graphic, as far as the purple fog and the eyesores, can sometimes get a little weird. Sometimes you may think you're safe and you're walking over this stuff. Sometimes it has to do with graphical settings, lag, latency, stuff like that. So Sometimes it can be out of your control. In fact, it's gotten me a couple of times where I thought I was safe and I wasn't. You can use Deterrence to mitigate some of the damage. However, it won't negate the damage completely. It'll only take off, unless you've glyphed it, it'll only take off about 30% of the damage. So it can buy you maybe an extra second or so. But if you notice you're starting to take damage as you're running over, then you immediately need to just move out of it. Like I said, it's basically a maze all the way around until he does a full 360. It's never the same maze, so you just have to kind of feel your way around it and get used to it. It may take a few times until you're comfortable with it. But just prioritize staying alive during this phase. If you can DPS and still get yourself around, then that's fine. However, it's not critical as long as you're alive at the end of this phase. That's what you want to concentrate on. Now, as I said before, once he does a full 360, this particular phase will end. And then you'll kind of basically go back to phase 1 again when you're dealing with the lingering gaze and the force of will. However, there's also a new mechanic now called the hungry eye that will basically kind of spawn right above him. You can't target this eye. It's invulnerable. What he does is he'll just target a random raid member, and he'll start channeling for about 15 seconds on this raid member. For every second that goes by, the damage he's doing will start to increase. So what you really want to do is after about 3 or 4 seconds, have somebody intercept that beam on that particular person, and then they'll take the beam, and then for another 3 or 4 seconds, and somebody else will come in and intercept that beam, and so on and so forth. You basically just want to keep that up and not have one person targeted by this beam for very long. As the damage will just start to get kind of ridiculous as the fight goes on. And then the fight will repeat itself. Once you've gone through the last disintegration beam phase, and you kind of go through that first phase again, the next colorblind phase will start. And it's the same thing again. However, keep in mind you still will have to deal with the life drain, and you'll also have to deal with lingering gaze going off sometimes while you're standing in the beams. So there's some other little mechanics going on. Nothing very drastic. Like I said, that phase is pretty simple. Just keep in mind the damage is going to also start to increase as from the first phase, as I said before. Depending on which beam you were standing in, you're going to have a certain amount of debuff on you from that first colorblind phase. So, for instance, if you were standing in the blue beam for a long time, you're going to have quite a healthy dose of those blue stacks on you, which means the longer you stand in that blue beam again, you're going to start taking more damage than you were the first time around. It's just something your healer's going to have to keep mindful of. If it looks like you're taking a lot of damage and you're not getting heals quickly enough, then just step out of the beam real quick, get healed up, and then step back in. But that's really pretty much it. The fight will just rinse and repeat. Once you're done with the second colorblind phase, you'll have to deal with another disintegration beam phase. Odds are your first couple attempts until your raid gets geared up, you're probably going to go through at least 2 colorblind phases and 2 disintegration beam phases. The colorblind phase, once you figure them out, are not that difficult. It's not end of the world. It's really the disintegration beam that really makes or breaks this fight. And it really just comes down to your raid members being comfortable with moving and being able to spot when they're in a bad point on the ground, or if they're able to move around the maze while still being able, especially the healers, as long as they can heal on the move. But that's really it. Once you've figured that mechanic out, the fight's actually very simple. But that's pretty much going to do it for this fight. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, concerns, complaints, just leave them down in the comments down below. But I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you later.